Assalamu alaikum and welcome to a very special event today on the reality of Palestinians in Jerusalem. I have a wonderful guest today from Jerusalem itself, Feroz Sherkawi. Sorry, excuse me for that. She is part of Grassroots Jerusalem. This organization has been established to map out what is happening in Jerusalem. They coordinate with different people and try and bring them together so that the Palestinians have their own narrative and an own discourse to counter the Israeli Judaization of Jerusalem and expelling of the Palestinian people. Jerusalem is such a complex issue in the manner that the colonization has operated, and the Palestinians are impacted in so many different ways. But how to understand some of this aspect, we have got approximately 15 to 20 minutes with Feroz, hopefully who will try and understand and bring us to get a better understanding of what is happening to Jerusalem and how Palestinians are being expelled from the holy city and undermining their livelihood, their presence, and their integrity and citizenship of Jerusalem itself. So without further ado, Feroz, welcome to the event and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Excited to be here. Thank you for having me. Salam from. So yes, I'll start from exactly where you finished, being a Palestinian in Jerusalem. What does it mean to be a Palestinian in Jerusalem? And the headline, the title is that being a Palestinian in Jerusalem means that you live the constant threat of displacement, of being expelled from your own hometown. What I will do in the coming 15 to 20 minutes is try to break down the different policies that are designed and implemented by the Israeli occupation authorities in order to Judaize and Israelize and Zionize the city of Jerusalem. Very quickly, just to go through the history building up to this moment, just to make sure that we are all on the same page. When I'm talking about the Palestinians in Jerusalem, I'm talking about the Palestinians living in the eastern part of occupied Jerusalem. The western part of Jerusalem was ethnically cleansed during the Nakba. There are no Palestinians living there, only Israeli settlers. But since 1967, when the second part of Jerusalem was occupied, the Israeli occupation authorities started designing and implementing policies, master plans, and legislation that aims at one main goal: displacing as many Palestinians as possible from the city of Jerusalem. Starting with the first policy, the legal status that Palestinians hold in Jerusalem. Immediately after the occupation in 1967, the occupation authorities imposed an Israeli legal status on the Palestinian residents of Jerusalem. This legal status is misleadingly called a permanent residency. But let's start there. It's not permanent at all. It expires every 10 years. People need to renew their identity cards that we call in our daily language the Jerusalem ID. So the Palestinians in Jerusalem are considered by the occupation authorities immigrants to the state of Israel. This legal status of a permanent residency is not unique to Israel. Many other countries give this status, some more easily and some not so easily, to immigrants or refugees who wish to settle down in a new country. So they get a permit to live inside the new borders, inside the country. Now, that's what makes this special legal status that Palestinians hold in Jerusalem interesting, to say the least, because these are the indigenous residents of the city, but who are treated as immigrants to their own city. Based on this legal status, based on the Israeli occupation laws, the Palestinians in Jerusalem, or any permanent residents for that matter, need to constantly prove that Jerusalem is their so-called center of life. Having Jerusalem as your center of life means that you have a physical address in Jerusalem. You either own or rent a house in Jerusalem, but you report on a physical address in Jerusalem. You also have to prove that you actually live in this address. So you have to produce water bills, electricity bills, and prove that you are paying taxes in Jerusalem, especially the arnona or the housing tax. Failing to prove all of these criteria, this gives the right to the occupation authorities, according to the Israeli law, to revoke your residency status. So Palestinians have to constantly produce documents that prove that they live in Jerusalem. Otherwise, the Israeli law says that they are illegally living and present in Jerusalem and they will be expelled. Now, we have to also add here that the testing of the Palestinian residency in Jerusalem happens de facto on the ground as well, where Israeli officials, representatives of the National Insurance Institution or the Ministry of Interior, go all the time to Palestinian communities, knocking on Palestinian doors and doing this sudden check. Let's see if you do actually live in the house you reported on. Let's see if you have toothbrushes and toothpaste in your physical address that prove that you actually brush your teeth and have your coffee in Jerusalem. Otherwise, you are lying and you are considered an illegal person, illegally present in Jerusalem. Your residency status will be revoked. Using this one policy, the Israeli occupation has displaced 15,000 Palestinians from Jerusalem since 1967. These Palestinians, according to the Israeli occupation, moved out of Jerusalem, and that takes away their right to live in their own hometown. So we, as Palestinians living in Jerusalem, are living this policy decade after decade. But I would like people listening to us and watching this from outside of Palestine to take a minute and a moment and think how this would apply to you. Imagine that you decide to go live somewhere else around the world, or that you want to go work abroad or study abroad. Imagine that this, according to the law in your country, means that you cannot return. You must not come back. This is exactly what Palestinians face in Jerusalem. So Palestinians not only have to do the tiring bureaucracy all the time of being treated as liars, as criminals who always have to prove at the Ministry of Interior, at the interrogations, that they live in Jerusalem, but also this means that we cannot move freely. We cannot move not only outside of Palestine, but also outside of the city of Jerusalem to other Palestinian cities around it. So if a Palestinian from Jerusalem moves to Ramallah in pursuit of housing opportunities or job opportunities or education, cannot leave for an extended amount of time. They have to return all the time and kind of check in with the Israeli occupation authorities. So the first tool of displacement that was designed and implemented in Jerusalem is the special legal status that the Palestinians in Jerusalem hold. Following the legal status, let's talk a little bit about planning policies. Planning policies are wide and complex, but I would like to focus on mainly three aspects: land confiscation, home demolition, and intentional underdevelopment. The Israeli colonizer, just like any other colonizer, knows that the main theme and issue when it comes to colonization and the steadfastness of indigenous people is the land. Who owns the land and who uses the land? These are the big questions. So also starting in 1967, master plans that have been put for Jerusalem by the Israeli occupation have been systematically allowing the Israeli authorities to confiscate Palestinian lands, Palestinian privately owned lands. Palestinian lands can be confiscated for various reasons. It can be military use, it can be other planning purposes like paving roads or establishing so-called national parks or municipal parks. And in Jerusalem, within the context of the Israeli colonization of Palestine, of course, these land confiscation cases happen not in order to provide projects to the community. So if you look at the Palestinian communities, you see that there might be a national park declared on the land, and the national park is supposed to be a good idea. It's supposed to be protecting environment and nature. It's supposed to be protecting animals, birds, or plants. It is supposed to provide welfare and well-being to the communities. But when it comes to the Israeli occupation and its national parks, clearly these national parks are a tool to dispossess Palestinians, take away the land that they very desperately need for housing, for schools, for hospitals and medical centers, roads, and other needs. So Palestinian land in Jerusalem is systematically confiscated by the Israeli occupation, not in order to implement projects that serve the Palestinian community. On the contrary, usually these lands are confiscated in order to build and expand colonies that are located not only outside of the Palestinian neighborhoods in the eastern part of occupied Jerusalem, but also in the heart of these neighborhoods. There are more than 200,000 Israeli settlers living in the colonies built after 67. And these colonies are located, as I was saying, not only outside, but also inside our communities. Land is also used for colonial roads. We see a huge network of colonial roads all over the West Bank, connecting settlements, colonies to each other, usually connecting these settlements to each other through Jerusalem. So there are various highways and settler roads that are built or in the process of building inside Jerusalem. Many of them sit on Palestinian privately owned land that was confiscated/robbed from its owners. Another purpose for confiscating lands can also be building Israeli industrial zones or business parks. So, for example, in the north of Jerusalem, there is the Atarot industrial zone, and now we have a new plan to establish some sort of Silicon Valley in Jerusalem, and it is planned in Wadi al-Joz, which is a Palestinian community just outside of the old city. This is an Israeli business district, and it is not economic development for Wadi al-Joz or the Palestinians living in that area, but rather another type of colony. So when we speak of colonies, it's not only residential colonies, but also economic colonization in the shape of industrial zones or business districts. So this is, in short, about the land confiscation. I want to move next to home demolition, which is another very effective tool of displacement. Demolishing a house is uprooting the people literally from the land, from the ground, from the city, and Palestinian homes are also systematically demolished by the Israeli authorities. Now, if you challenge the Israeli occupation authorities and say you are demolishing Palestinian homes in Jerusalem, they would claim that no, that's not the case. We have a law. The law says that any new construction must come with a permit built based on a master plan. And they claim that Palestinians in Jerusalem build illegally, and that is why they demolish the houses. So they say, we don't demolish Palestinian homes per se, we demolish homes that are built illegally, and that's based on our law. Now, let's take a minute here and try to look into the details. In the last few years, the Israeli occupation authorities rejected more than 90% of the Palestinian applications for building permits. So if a Palestinian owns a piece of land and they wish to build a house on it, they apply for a building permit from the Israeli occupation authorities. Usually these applications are rejected, leaving the Palestinians with no other choice, either to build illegally or leave Jerusalem. Usually the excuse that is given for rejecting the applications is the fact that the master plans of our neighborhoods and villages inside Jerusalem were not expanded or developed to include new construction. But whose responsibility is it to expand these master plans? Whose responsibility is it to develop master plans that fit the natural growth of the population? It's the authority that controls the place. And in this case, we are talking about the Israeli occupation authorities who, first of all, do not expand or develop our master plans for our neighborhoods, and then use it as an excuse for rejecting our applications for building permits. And then most of the Palestinian people, of course, don't want to leave their hometown. They don't want to leave Al-Quds, and that is why they take the risk and build illegally. Usually when you build illegally, you are fined for illegal construction. So many families start paying huge amounts of money as fines for illegal construction, while they are supposed to be in a process or a procedure to retroactively legalize the construction, which is a joke and a lie, because of course you never really succeed to retroactively legalize the construction of your house. So after paying tens of thousands of shekels in fines for illegal construction, comes the demolition order. And you are told by the Israeli occupation authorities, you either demolish this house or we come demolish it for you. Whether it is a self-demolition or the Israeli bulldozer coming and demolishing your house, in both cases, it is the uprooting of Palestinian families who not only are displaced, uprooted, lose their house, but also have to cover the expenses of these home demolitions. So the whole process from applying for a permit where you pay a lot of money for that procedure, then paying fines, and then covering the expenses of the demolition of your own house usually bankrupts the Palestinian families. So at the end of this story, a Palestinian family is not only homeless in Jerusalem, but also poor and bankrupt in the awfully expensive city of Jerusalem, which usually means that these families have to leave Jerusalem to look for available or affordable housing. In Jerusalem, needless to say, the Israeli occupation does not build new housing opportunities for Palestinians, and so this usually means displacement out of the city.
Okay. That was very, very well covered in the communicates you've been given for us. Thank you very much. It's very harrowing. I don't know how to put it in any other way. What I always find very difficult, and maybe we would want to discuss this, is how to categorize and understand Israel's action. We normally talk about colonization or settler colonialism, but what you have explained goes beyond that. Even settler colonial states, say in Australia or Canada, or even New Zealand, they never demanded that the indigenous people prove their residency and expel them. They were definitely discriminated and marginalized, and even a certain extent genocides were carried out. But we have a different dimension here, and that's why maybe people also tend to mix or sometimes also apportion the title for apartheid state. How much of that do you think applies to Jerusalem itself as an apartheid system?
Well, first of all, just to be clear, I'm talking about the very special reality in Jerusalem. Other places, colonization and colonialism takes different shapes, different colors. This is the very special case in Jerusalem, where for the state, the colonial state of Israel, the goal is to continue with the Nakba, the displacement, the empty Jerusalem of its Palestinian residents, which is also what the colonies and settlements are doing all over the West Bank, basically pushing the Palestinians into small areas, and while expansion of colonies happens all around them. Now, to your question about apartheid, I think that it is important to notice that there are practices of apartheid in Palestine, but it is just one tool that the colonial state is using against the owners of the land, the indigenous people on the land. The segregation, the double standards, the different legislation applying to different groups is a tool to achieve the colonial goals in Jerusalem and elsewhere in Palestine. So the goal is not to oppress the group of Palestinians and discriminate against them when it comes to resource division or budgets, but rather to use apartheid as a tool to implement long-term colonial plans. That is why we at Grassroots Al-Quds, we'd rather not frame the situation in Palestine merely as an apartheid. I mean, let's also ask a bigger question. What was apartheid in South Africa? It was a colonial tool as well. I mean, South Africa in that period, that was a colonial state as well. It's the white colonizer that is using apartheid in order to establish their control over South Africa. So I think that it is important, because then the next question would be, so what are we fighting for? What are we demanding? Are we demanding equality? Am I demanding, when I say that Israel is an apartheid state, am I saying what the Palestinians need is the same amount of budget and money and resources and development, or economic development and jobs? No, this is not what the Palestinians want. What the Palestinians want is self-determination, to be able to make our own plans. So we are always careful not to portray what's happening in Jerusalem as merely a discrimination against a certain group, because this group doesn't want the Israeli authorities to give it its rights. This group says these are not the legal or legitimate authorities here. We would like to have our own authorities that are making our own plans.
Sure, that's a very good distinction between ideological and political implementation of that ideology. And I think that's how you, if I'm right to read you, that you're trying to differentiate colonial ideology away from an apartheid policy. And they're the two distinctions that you make. I think that's very good clarification, Fairoz. Before we proceed, I think it'd be good also for us to hear about your organization.
Yes.
What do you guys do, and how do you operate before we proceed?
Yeah, thank you. So Grassroots Al-Quds was established in 2011, and our goal is to act as a platform for Palestinian community mobilization and networking in Jerusalem. Because in addition to the different policies that are applied here against the Palestinian presence in Jerusalem, it is clear that the policy or strategy of divide and conquer is very present. It is very actively used against the Palestinians in Jerusalem. So the fragmentation of Palestinian communities in Jerusalem is another big challenge, because when we mobilize, when we organize, when we start acting and struggling against the occupation, it happens very locally. It is very much localized within a certain neighborhood or village or refugee camp. What we aim to do, or what we are doing in Jerusalem, is act also as a place that gathers these initiatives together and these organizations together, so that we Palestinians not only react to immediate concern, issues of immediate concern and urgent matters, but also start together as a whole city, make our own long-term plans for Jerusalem. Because the way things are going in Jerusalem today is that everyone has a say about the destiny, about the future of Jerusalem, except for the Palestinians in it. The Israeli occupation authorities have very clear plans. Zionize the city, displace the Palestinians. On the other hand, our own political leadership is absent. I mean, it's absent everywhere, but especially in Jerusalem. The Palestinian Authority, we don't have time to go into that, but the Palestinian Authority is another obstacle in our way for liberation. So also it does not play a role at all in Jerusalem that supports the steadfastness of the Palestinian people. And this means that advocacy in our name, development in our communities are left in the hands of international actors, United Nations agencies, international NGOs, and donors and foundations that come here supposedly to support the Palestinian struggle, but then they come with their own problems. They come with their dictated agendas. They decide how our struggle looks like, how our struggle sounds like. And that's exactly why we thought that there is a need for this platform that amplifies Palestinian voices, that think and plan long-term policies for Jerusalem. So what we do is research. We research the Jerusalem story, the Jerusalem history, reality today, initiatives on the ground, and we provide this knowledge as a base of knowledge that is needed for liberation. And then we also support local mobilization that is happening in Jerusalem. We work with the different organizations and initiatives, seeing how we can help them implement their own projects, but also gather them and invite them to participate in networks. So for example, right now, we work with around 8 communities on a campaign in tourism, enhancing and promoting tourism into the marginalized communities of Jerusalem, the Palestinian communities that have a lot to offer tourists, but the Israeli Zionist propaganda in tourism, and that is loyally followed by international platforms, hides away their existence from the tourist experience. So right now we are working, for example, on this kind of campaign. So networking locally is important, but we also network globally. We have a global mobilization department that sees that it is very important to connect the different struggles around the world, first of all, to each other, but also to connect Jerusalem with Palestine solidarity movements and, of course, the Palestinian diaspora outside of Palestine.
So going back to your tourism aspect, would you say that people who come from abroad, they can contact you and you could help them sort of have their, if you like, ethical tour of Jerusalem and Palestine?
Exactly, even more than that. Well, first of all, thank you for mentioning the tour. We do offer a tour in Jerusalem. We offer a political tour or a Jerusalem reality tour. We call it the grassroots tour of Al-Quds. And it is a tour that takes groups around the city, showing them what it means to be a Palestinian living in Jerusalem on the ground. But even more than that, we think that there is a need for a louder Palestinian voice approaching and talking, speaking with visitors and tourists. Because again, the Israeli propaganda is very Zionist. It's very systematically hiding away Palestinian places to visit, Palestinian people to meet, Palestinian products to buy. And again, it is followed loyally by international engines like Google or Airbnb or Booking.com and many others. And so what we started this, we started with the political tour. And then in 2014, we published our political tourist guidebook to Jerusalem that we called Wujud. Wujud is Arabic for existence or presence. And we just published the second edition of it. Here I have a copy right next to me. We published the second edition of it last year. And Wujud does exactly that. On the first hand, Wujud is a book to have about Jerusalem, to read the Jerusalem story. So it has a whole section, a chapter about the political reality in Jerusalem, but then again, it's a tourist guidebook. It tells you how to be an ethical, responsible tourist in Jerusalem and elsewhere in Palestine. So what are the places to see in Palestinian neighborhoods? What are the shops and markets to go visit and buy your souvenirs from? How you can not only be an ethical tourist, but also support the Palestinian steadfastness and support the Palestinian economy by investing your money in it.
Let's go back to some serious. Thank you for explaining to us about your grassroots organization. It's very, very helpful. And I would encourage people to visit your website, and those who are visiting Jerusalem to at least come and visit you guys for guidance. I think that'd be really good. But let's go back to more serious stuff on the ground. That's what's happening. As you yourself have mentioned, that Israel works with impunity in the international arena, gets away with whatever it wants to do. And the fact is, those in the politics in the West and around the world know exactly what is happening to the Palestinians. It's not news. Yeah. Yet Israel carries on, and they keep on rolling the red carpet for the Israeli politicians and the diplomats. How do you think Palestinians themselves and those who are concerned, NGOs and people who are listening to this, how do you think they can act to bring about a change in the mindset and the construct, a Zionist discourse towards a more partial understanding of the region, impartial rather, excuse me, so that the two parts can be brought together and we have freedom for the Palestinians?
Well, first of all, I think that learning, hearing, looking for the Palestinian story, hearing the Palestinian voices, that's why we research about Jerusalem and we translate all of our writings into English, because we think that it's important that people know what's happening on the ground. And even though I agree with you that many people know, or most people know what's happening in Palestine, but I think that there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation. It's also about how you tell the story of what's happening of Jerusalem. And the Zionist propaganda is very good at saying, whatever horrible things we are doing it because our security is threatened by the Palestinians, and the whole portraying and framing of the story is important. So first of all, I think that not swallowing whole what your media is telling you is the first thing. Not trusting that TV channels or websites are all telling you exactly what's going on in Palestine. But secondly, I think that we need to understand that the support that the Israeli occupation state is receiving is not only governmental official support, but also economic support by doing business with different corporations and businesses around the world. So I think that here also there are two different things to do. The first one is affect or change your own country's foreign policy on Palestine. Speak to your decision makers and legislators and say, not with my taxpayer money. No, you're not supporting the atrocities of the occupation in Palestine with my taxpayer money. That's first of all, and not only because of the money, of course, but also ideologically, I think that people need to have that responsibility ethically, that their country does not support the oppression of people around the world, whether it is in Palestine or elsewhere. So changing foreign policy is certainly a responsibility. And this starts by starting a dialogue, a discussion back home, discussion that starts even with your aunts and uncles around the dinner table. It doesn't have to be, of course, we wish it to become and hope that it becomes a big campaign mobilizing and changing. But I think also just having this, seeing the effect also around you is important. But then again, also, be careful and aware where your money goes. You know, I see it in the background, I check the label postcard from Friends of Al-Aqsa. So similar to that, know where your money is spent. Are you buying avocados that come from Palestine and marketed as Palestinian and as Israeli, and you are supporting the Israeli economy by doing that? So first of all, individually, boycott Israel, boycott Israeli products, and not only settlement products, I have to say, because it's great to boycott settlement products, but that's the minimum of what people can do. There is no such thing as a separate settlement economy. It's only one economy, the Israeli economy. So whether you buy it from a factory that is in 67 occupied lands or 48 occupied lands, you are supporting the same economic system. And but also more than that, also apply pressure on your own corporations and companies that are invested in this occupation. There are so many corporations, international, multinational corporations that have factories on stolen Palestinian lands, that are stealing Palestinian resources, especially water in this case, and cheap labor, of course. And so it's important to understand that it's not just the diplomatic support that Israel is receiving from so many countries around the world that allow it to maintain this horrible project of its here, but also the money that it makes from business partnerships. Today, Israel sells everything, and not only our natural resources. Today, the Israeli occupation sells its expertise in oppressing the Palestinian people, teaching police forces and army forces around the world what it does best here, oppressing Palestinians and displacing Palestinians. That's in addition to arms and arms trades and whatnot. So I think that there are so many things that people can do, so many things that start from little individual actions, but also grow into bigger movements for justice and integrity of the Palestinian people.
Normally, you get individuals who are skeptical, who would say, what does one individual's not buying an avocado do? I mean, why should they bother?
Well, I think that first of all, this is an approach for life. So it's not only about Palestine. It's like, okay, Nestle is a bad company, and if you buy Nestle products, then you are oppressing children in South America that work in slavery conditions to produce chocolate for you. So it's up to your own responsibility, and I think that this is serving the oppressor when we say, what would one individual do? I think it's clear that one individual with another individual and another individual becomes a movement. And I think that first of all, for your own conscience, just to sleep well at night, that's for you, your own gain. But also, it's important to understand that it's never just a few individuals here and there. This might be what the Israeli propaganda wants you to believe. But really, many people having and adopting these practices creates a movement, and we need a movement to happen.
Thank you for that. Now, you've covered a lot of ground really today. You've talked about land appropriation, expelling of the Palestinians, the policy of dispossession and discrimination in Jerusalem. We have always seen over the years that this has been getting worse. Do you see, is there a plan, do you think, that is being unfolded wherein a certain percentage of Palestinians would then be accepted by the Israeli state? a minimal amount. And considering, or you've also touched the fact that you have got no Palestinian Authority defending you or the international community, how do you see Israeli plans to Judaize Jerusalem? I suppose that's the best word to use here, or Zionize it. How does that, you see that being unfolded over the next few years or decade?
Well,
or have we got that long? Sorry.
Speaking of numbers, the first master plan that was made for Jerusalem was made in 1970. It is known as Jerusalem 2020, even though it never was authorized and confirmed officially as a master plan for Jerusalem. It is the document to look at if you want to know what are the Israeli plans for Jerusalem. And there, for the first time, there was a number mentioned there. The Israeli occupation authorities say that they wish to achieve and maintain a so-called demographic balance between Jews and non-Jews, their terminology, in Jerusalem. And this imbalance, if I may correct the term, is 70% Jewish, 30% non-Jewish. In other words, 70% Israeli, 30% Palestinian. So this is one number that is somewhere mentioned in many places by Israeli officials and documents that shows the goal for Jerusalem. But of course, it is easy to guess that the goal is much higher than that. The goal is to have as little Palestinian presence as possible in Jerusalem. If it goes down to zero, even better. Now, what we see happening decade after decade is that this is slowly, steadily working. And so even though these numbers were put, at the same time, the numbers today are closer to 60-40. So it's not really working in that direction. And that is why in the last few years, we have been witnessing a change in the trend. So expulsion and displacement is still going on, and still the policies are all still intact and they do their job. But at the same time, the Israeli occupation realized that it needs to find an answer to these stubborn Palestinians that are not so easily uprooted from Jerusalem. And so they started in the last few years implementing also policies of inclusion. So how do we include the Palestinians in Jerusalem while still disempowering them and still making sure that our goals, political goals, are met in Jerusalem? We colonize their education, but mostly their economy. So what happens today is that there are more opportunities for Palestinians to, for example, study at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Now, this is not because Israel is a democracy and allows Palestinians to go to the Israeli university there, but rather because they know very well that it is very important for normalizing the Zionist presence in Jerusalem. When you go to an Israeli institution for education, then you normalize its presence there, and it's the easier and faster way into the Israeli labor market. And so in recent years also we have been witnessing that there are many different training centers maybe that are open for Palestinians, how they can go and find jobs in the Israeli market. Now again, Israel would market this as job opportunities created for Palestinians. And it's very important to be careful here and realize that this is not, of course, in the favor of the Palestinian people, but rather the colonization of the Palestinian economy in a way that the Israeli economy today is eating up the Palestinian economy in Jerusalem. And walking around Salah ad-Din area here, just outside of the old city of Jerusalem, you start noticing branches of Israeli chains, whether it is coffee shops or clothes shops that are opening in our own important economic veins, the main streets around the old city. So this is the trend that we watch happening now in Jerusalem.
There's one more aspect that is sort of propelled quite subtly, that Israeli Palestinian issue is really to do with Muslims and Jews. And of course, Jerusalem is one of those things that exposes that, the fact that Jerusalem is the site of Christianity, the birth of Christianity, and it has some of the holiest Christian sites there. and many Christians live in Jerusalem as well. So I just want to know how Palestinian Christians are fared and what is their position. Do they have a third category within the Palestinians, or are they treated as a whole, the other of the Israelis?
Well, I'm happy for this question. First of all, it's important to focus on the fact that this is not a religious conflict. It's not a conflict over Al-Aqsa and that's it. Al-Aqsa is used by the colonizer in order to meet colonial goals. And it's Israel's benefit to divide us into religious groups and say there are Christian Palestinians and there are Muslim Palestinians. I mean, it's always been the case. There have been Muslim, Christian, and Druze Palestinians living here for so long, and even Jewish Palestinians who were here way before the Zionist immigration, and dividing them is in the favor of the colonizer. And portraying this and framing this as a religious conflict is very dangerous. While if you look at our history as Palestinians, Christian Palestinians, just like Muslim Palestinians, are, they're basically Palestinian people. So first of all, they are oppressed the same way. They have their homes demolished. They have their lands confiscated. They have their schools locked down. They have their economy suffocated because they are an integral part of the Palestinian people, whether in Jerusalem or outside of Jerusalem. Also, we see that they have been an integral part of our struggle for liberation. They are mobilizers. They are freedom fighters. They are prisoners. They are martyrs. So it's very important not to go into that very problematic area where we look at what's happening in Jerusalem or Palestine as merely a conflict between two religions that are fighting over a holy site. That is not the case. And, 3 years ago, there was the Lions Gate uprising in Jerusalem. Bab al-Asbat is Lions Gate. And there was an uprising there. You can read about it since we are short on time, but there was an uprising there because the Israeli occupation wanted to put metal detectors and surveillance cameras at the entrances to Al-Aqsa compound. When 10,000 people met every evening outside of Lions Gate, they were not all Muslims. They were not all Muslims that were fighting for a mosque. They were all Palestinians. There were religious people. There were secular people. There were Christians and Muslims, and there were all kinds of Palestinians outside fighting for the symbol of their ownership and belonging to Jerusalem. Al-Aqsa is not just a holy site. Al-Aqsa is a symbol of our belonging to Al-Quds, to Jerusalem, and that is why everyone was there defending it. And I think that's very important to remind everyone because, again, not only Israeli but other voices as well would like to highlight this as a religious conflict, and that's dangerous and untrue.
Thank you very much indeed for a very, very enlightening talk, really, to provide us with a glimpse of what is happening to the Palestinians. I mean, you've touched many issues that I'm sure will disturb a lot of people who don't know much about Jerusalem. And even those who do know, will be moved and will want to do something. For me, I will conclude. Before I conclude, is there anything else you would like to say to our viewers or how they can get more engaged on the issue of Palestine and for justice?
Well, it's just an invitation to everyone to learn more about Jerusalem. So you can visit our website. You can just look up Grassroots Al-Quds. Our website, our social media have a lot of information. We share news and updates about Jerusalem all the time. So be in touch and check our channel so you learn more and watch more about Jerusalem.
Thank you very much for that, Fairoz. And to our listeners, we've had something amazing today. We've understood how the policies are operating of land appropriation, house demolitions, expelling the Palestinian people, the issue of Palestine and Jerusalem in particular, how different communities have worked together, and the aspect of colonialism that has been explained, I think is very important for us to understand. And how to counter that, I think, is a responsibility for everybody. We talk about decolonialism, we talk about post-colonial states, but really colonialism is living and kicking in Palestine. And therefore, the job has not finished. And therefore, I appeal to everybody who is listening to be mobilized for justice and for ourselves, to create a more fairer global society where everybody is respected for who they are and what they are. And I hope with those words, we encourage everybody to join us in our next session as well. and to, as has been mentioned, to visit the website of Grassroots Al-Quds and also Friends of Al-Aqsa. So thank you very much for joining us, Faroiza, and thank you very much for all of our viewers as well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.